Chapter 8. Emmett stood at the front of the room, flicking his pen anxiously. He was used to delivering team meetings, but today felt different. There were extra people there for a start. I'd like to begin by introducing you all to Detective Leading Senior Constable Bianca Tardio and Detective Senior Constable Ted Medhurst. They're joining us from the Homicide Squad, and I'm certain that their immense experience will be of invaluable assistance to us. Emmett paused, grateful for the nodding heads of the new detectives. We have a lot to do, so I appreciate you all coming in so early. Late yesterday, I heard from the temping agency where Rosemary Norman had been working. At the time she disappeared, she was placed in a secretarial role at a city finance firm. She was contracted there for another 8 weeks, but she failed to show up for shifts from last Monday. That's the 15th of July. Her brother claims he spoke to her on the Saturday afternoon prior to this, and as we know, she failed to show for a family birthday gathering on the Tuesday evening. This morning, Detective Tardio and I will visit the finance company before heading to the nursing home where... Shouldn't we be handing the Norman case over to homicide? Morton interrupted, not bothering to finish chewing the large chunk of croissant he just gobbled. They've got a body now, so why is it still our problem? The superintendent has asked me to lead the Norman investigation, but we have our homicide colleagues here to assist us. I'm sure you all know that Detective Tardio led the Portsea murders case, and Detective Medhurst was instrumental in solving the fatal Footscray fire. But we have dozens of unsolved missing persons to get through. I know, and we can't become complacent about any of those. Emmett paused as he thought about the massive workload ahead of them. But for now, I'll get you and Carter to focus on the Gibson disappearance. This morning, I'd like you to visit the family deli and speak to staff members there. We need to firm up Brian's claim that he was at work all day last Friday, when his wife disappeared. You'll also need to follow up on that security footage you found. From the vision you gathered, it appears that Natalie boarded a tram after dropping her children off at the football club. We need to know where she got off and what happened next. What about tracking Rosemary's phone? You said that was a priority? Stephen raised his hand, as though a child trying to get his teacher's attention. I'd be happy to stay back and do that. Emmett smiled, aware that his younger colleague was attempting to get out of being paired with Morton again. But there wasn't much he could do. Medhurst has offered to take over that task, as he's had prior success with triangulating data. He's also going to go over Rosemary Norman's medical and financial records and start getting in touch with any friends or extended family members. What about our other cases? We're getting assistance from other units with any new cases that come in, and later today I'll be going over our outstanding tasks. The superintendent is aware we have a lot going on. When are we expecting to hear from pathology regarding the Norman autopsy? Bianca Tardio's voice was far deeper than her small frame suggested, and Emmett noticed both Stephen and Morton turn in surprise. We are expecting a preliminary report in the next day or so, Emmett said, unable to stop himself from picturing the horrific cuts on Rosemary's body. Hopefully that will give us a much better understanding of how that poor woman died. Owen Peters had only just pulled up in the gravel car park when he noticed the small figure sitting sadly in the yard. It was far too early for children to be dropped off at school, and the teacher felt his temper simmer as he gulped down the last of his bottled mineral water and headed towards the boy sitting on the bench. He was sick of dealing with irresponsible parents. "Spencer," he called out, once he'd recognised the pale face of the frail child. "Good to have you back. But what are you doing here so early? The yard duty teacher hasn't even arrived." The small boy coughed nervously before standing up. "Mum had to go to work early, so she told me to wait here." Owen frowned. "She missed so many shifts while I was in hospital, so she needs to catch up." "I see. And how is your asthma?" The boy coughed again. It's not good. The teacher said I had pneumonia. They told me I was meant to stay home today, but Mum couldn't afford to take another day off work. I have my puffer though, and those white tablets I hate. Owen felt his nostrils flare. He'd arrived early so he could catch up on some work, not babysit abandoned children. Come with me. As the pair walked slowly towards the staff room, the wheezy boy held the teacher's hand, while Owen mentally rehearsed the angry phone call he would be making to Spencer's mother later that day. As a child, he'd idolised his own teachers, imagining the job to be one of prestige and importance and influence. He'd worked hard to establish his career, struggling through high school to get the required university admission score, and even accepting a college placement in a country town 3 hours' drive away, only to discover that most parents saw him as little more than a glorified nanny, the school a daycare that they could use at their whim. "What does your mother do for work?" he asked as they entered the main brick building and passed through the first of many corridors that wound their way to the modest staff room. "She cleans houses, but her back hurts a lot." "I see. And what about Dad? What does he do?" Spencer's hand slipped out of the teacher's grip as he stopped, looking up in confusion. "I don't have a dad." Owen's shoulders tensed. He'd never known his father either. That didn't excuse poor parenting. "Any brothers or sisters?" "I have an older sister, Abby, but she doesn't live with us anymore. She was always fighting with Mum, so Mum told her to go away. I miss her though." "That's no good. Why don't you sit down on the couch over there? How often are you supposed to take your medicine? Do you need to do that now?" The boy shuffled back on the worn brown couch, placing his backpack on his lap and hugging it like a soft toy. "I have the blue puffer whenever I can't breathe properly, and I have my brown puffer before I eat, and I have the yucky white tablets at night. I already had my morning puffs." "Okay then," Owen sighed, turning to the crockery shelf in the kitchenette where he kept his large mug. Students weren't supposed to be in the staff room, but there was no one around, and he desperately needed a coffee. "Would you like a warm drink? We have chocolate powder." Spencer shook his head, still hugging his bag. "I need to mark some assignments, but I'll put the TV on for you." After flicking the remote and finding the most appropriate children's show, Owen parked himself up at the kitchen bench. Rifling through his satchel, he pulled out the folder of papers he was yet to mark and took a sip of his instant coffee. "Oh dear, I've lost my hat again. Do you know where I've put it?" A high-pitched animated voice squawked from the television. Spencer giggled, and then coughed. Owen stared at the stack of assignments, flipping uninterestedly between poorly drawn pictures of hearts and lungs. His grade 6 class was learning about the human body as part of their physical education curriculum. This assignment was all about how particular organs worked during exercise. He picked up a red pen, then put it down again. He couldn't focus. "Mr. Peters, I need to wee." With an exaggerated sigh, Owen marched Spencer down the corridor to the staff bathrooms. As he listened to the sound of trickling pee, he shook his head. Why were there so many negligent parents? "Did you wash your hands?" he asked, without needing an answer. Spencer disappeared back to the basin. Back in the staff room, Owen gave up on marking the papers and instead let himself stare pointlessly at the television, indulging his morbid thoughts. He didn't like to dwell on his own situation, but seeing this sad child had stirred up painful truths. He and his girlfriend Charlotte had been trying for a baby for over 5 years. Despite repeated trips to the doctors, counselling sessions, and visits to so-called fertility experts, they'd ended up, like so many others, on a sad cycle of unsuccessful IVF treatments, their hopes fading with every failed attempt. Owen walked to the kitchenette and sloshed the remainder of his now cold coffee down the sink. The worst part was seeing the excitement on Charlotte's face after each invasive procedure, when she described how positive she felt that she'd finally fallen pregnant, only to have her heart broken when the doctor would inform them of yet another implantation failure. He swallowed a lump in his throat. The last time had been the worst. "You know what?" his girlfriend had said, with glistening eyes. "I'm absolutely certain this time will be successful. I can't explain it, but something just feels different." Owen had foolishly got caught up in her optimism and had spent the next weeks investigating baby names and local schools, only to wake one morning to the sound of Charlotte's pitiful cries from behind the bathroom door, when the bleeding had started yet again. He unclasped his fists and turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. Now they were in the middle of what would be their fourth and final round of IVF treatment. If it wasn't successful this time, they would have to accept that they weren't destined to be parents. It was a painful decision, but they simply couldn't afford it anymore. They'd already had to remortgage their small house to pay for the specialists, and there was no accounting for the emotional toll the whole saga had taken on them. Owen plastered a smile on his face as Cameron, the music teacher, walked into the staff room. "We have a visitor," he said, pointing to Spencer, who was looking dozy on the couch. Cameron's eyebrows rose. "Yes, Mum thought it would be a good idea to use the school as a childcare service yet again, didn't she, Spencer?" As the small child rocked uncomfortably on the couch, Owen wiped his clammy hands on his trousers. He hoped more than anything he would get a chance to be a father. But in the meantime, fate seemed determined to leave him stuck dealing with those who didn't deserve children. Cameron smirked, disappearing to the back of the room to investigate the many items poking out of his staff pigeonhole. Owen watched the small boy on the couch close his eyes and drift to sleep, his pale lips resting open as difficult breaths strained in and out. He shook his head. The world was so often unjust. By the time they'd reached the top of Collins Street, Emmett was well used to his new colleague's deep voice. Bianca had not stopped talking. "There's just something about the finance industry, isn't there?" she said as they pulled up in a loading zone, outside a designer shop that seemed to Emmett to sell nothing but scarves. "It must be something to do with dealing with money all day. It just turns people into soulless jerks." Emmett murmured without interest. He'd heard enough about Bianca's dating disaster with a finance executive when she was in her early 30s. He wanted to focus on the task at hand. "And of course," she huffed, closing the car door with an unnecessary thud, "they would get the best building in the street. Money certainly talks, doesn't it?" Emmett looked to where she was gesturing. At least his new colleague was right about this. The building that housed the DGP finance office was a glorious heritage Victorian, which rose to the sky like a sentinel watching over the many workers who buzzed up and down the busy city street. Ornate arches adorned the doorways and large windows, while elegant columns climbed up to the heavens. It was a long way from the square, almost apologetic architecture of their new police headquarters. "Let's go." An elevator took them to the 12th floor. An annoyingly slow ride punctuated by city workers holding doors open at every level so they could finish their inane conversations with those still inside. Emmett was relieved to get out. "Good morning." A woman with a sharp nose and unusual red glasses greeted them. "Are you with the Ortango group? We have refreshments in the boardroom if you'd like to go through." Emmett glanced across the open-plan office to the glassed room where several men in suits were already gathered. "No." Bianca's gravelly voice had its usual effect, causing the woman to involuntarily flinch. I'm Detective Tardio, and this is Detective Corbin. We're here to discuss one of your contract employees, Rosemary Norman. Who was her superior? Rosemary? The woman seemed confused. Oh, the receptionist. She's not here anymore. She was only from one of those temping agencies. So unreliable. You know how they are. We know she's not here anymore. Emmett stepped forward. That's why we're here to speak to her superior. Who would that be? After looking around anxiously, the woman darted off in the direction of a corner office. She returned a moment later with a squat, rather unattractive man whom she introduced as Jeff DeGrassi Porteous, the company director. Please, just call me Jeff. The man slipped his right arm forward, and Emmett had the sensation of shaking hands with a snake, the arm then slithering back down the man's side. You've come at a rather busy time, I'm afraid. We have investors visiting from the Netherlands. Emmett noticed Bianca roll her eyes. But why don't you come into my office? It will be quieter there. The detectives followed the director, aware of the many eyes upon them. Please, take a seat. Can I get you something? Pauline! The man clicked his fingers oddly, and a statuesque woman with glowing olive skin appeared. Get some coffees, would you? What did you want? As the woman waited in the doorway, Emmett was about to request his usual strong espresso when he noticed the scowl on his colleague's face. We're fine, thank you. Bianca crossed her arms. So, how can I help? Jeff continued once they were alone again, the director leaning back so that his right hand rested unpleasantly on the fold between his chest and stomach. We're investigating the disappearance of Rosemary Norman, Emmett said, deliberately avoiding the announcement that she'd been found murdered. We understand she was contracted to work here for a period of 3 months, was it? Jeff scratched his head. That sounds about right. I don't deal with the hiring of temps personally, but we usually get them in for a few months at a time, and if they're good, we extend the contract. I see. And was Rosemary good? Again, the company director seemed baffled. I suppose so. I didn't hear the phone ringing too much, so that's always a good sign. And when did you realise that Rosemary was no longer presenting for her shifts? That would have been about a week ago, the Monday last week. I remember that because Sally was livid. She's our accounts manager, but we've had to stick her on the desk ever since. No men were available then? Bianca scoffed. Sorry? Emmett cast his colleague a warning glare. Now was not the time. Forgive me. Bianca cleared her throat. What was your impression of Rosemary? Not much. Jeff chortled, the detective's disdain apparently going right over his head. She was a very plain woman. Messy red hair, I remember that. She never said much to me, just brought in papers when I needed photocopying, helped with booking clients for meetings, normal secretary stuff. Was she socializing with anyone here? The company director balked. Socializing? As in dating? Yes, dating. Or maybe just catching up for drinks with colleagues after work. That sort of thing. Not that I know of. She wasn't much of a looker, I've said that though, haven't I? Jeff stopped to pat his stomach. And I don't think she was friends with any of the girls. But let me check. Hang on. Pauline? Again, the tall woman appeared in the doorway, this time holding several thick folders to her chest. Do you know if any of the girls were friends with that receptionist we had? Rosemary? Pauline looked blank. The redhead woman, with the curls. The one that didn't show up for shifts, so we had to get Sally on the desk. Oh, that woman. No, I don't think so. See? Jeff said, as Pauline darted off again. I don't think she was very friendly with anyone here. She just turned up, did her job, and left. But I suppose that's all you want from a receptionist, really? Right. Emmett flipped his notebook closed. Your security cameras. Can we have a look at them? We'll need to go through the footage from last week, especially the Friday, which was the last day she was in, if I'm correct. I believe so. Jeff led the detectives back to the woman with the red glasses. They need to see our security footage. Do you know who can work that? After several tedious attempts at finding the right person, Bianca and Emmett were finally seated in a smaller office behind the main reception area, where Kim, a lean, freckle-faced man, was operating the company's security system. Can I leave you with that? He asked, having found footage of Rosemary arriving to work the week prior to her disappearance. I'm supposed to be assisting the presentation in the boardroom. That's fine, thank you. Emmett took the computer mouse. The most useful angle came from a camera which sat above the reception desk and pointed to the elevator. From that vantage point, the detectives could watch the top of Rosemary's head as she sat at her desk, sometimes bobbing up to scan a document or disappearing out of frame before returning with a mug or snack. Despite greeting everyone who arrived and left via the elevator, Rosemary was never seen to engage in any extended conversations with her colleagues, and her pre-packed lunch was always eaten alone at her desk. She doesn't really fit into this environment, does she? Bianca noted, as they watched Rosemary arrive on the Friday morning, which had turned out to be her final day there. She was dressed in loose-fitting linen trousers, a relaxed blouse, and a cardigan. She's wearing different clothes to the ones she was murdered in, Emmett said quietly. So we can assume she wasn't killed on the Friday. Yes, Bianca agreed, which makes her brother's claims of talking to her on the Saturday afternoon seem plausible. They kept watching, the whirring of the clock in the corner gobbling up the last of Rosemary's life. Did you see that? Emmett stopped the recording and rewound slowly. The security footage had reached Friday evening now, and they'd watched Rosemary pack her few belongings into her usual woven handbag for the last time. He played it again. There. See? Emmett pointed as the woman picked up a book, which could have been a diary or a notepad, placed it back down on the desk, hesitated, and then decided to take it with her after all. She was considering leaving the book behind, so we can be certain that whatever happened next, she was intending on returning to work on Monday. Yes, Bianca agreed, before flopping back in her chair. And then what? Emmett hit play. On the screen before them, Rosemary slung her bag over her shoulder and quickly dashed for the exit. As she stepped into the elevator, she stared straight ahead, her gaze unflinching as the silver doors closed, swallowing her up inside. The detectives let the recording run a little longer, on the off chance she reappeared. She didn't. And then what? Emmett whispered. The boy sat at the side of the house, crouching down low so he couldn't be seen. He hated the new place. It was even smaller than Maria's house, and with no other children to play with, he spent most of his days bored and lonely. The old couple didn't even have a proper backyard, and they wouldn't let him play cricket or throw balls around in case he damaged their stupid fruit trees. It wasn't fair. From the kitchen window above his head, he could smell gentle wafts of smoke escaping from the stovetop, where the old woman would no doubt be standing, stirring chunky pumpkin soup or that horrible stew she insisted on making in one of the large brown pots. The boy hated the woman's cooking, but he loved the smell of smoke. It reminded him of the fire that had swallowed up the living room in Maria's house. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. If he tried hard enough, he could almost pretend he was back there, lying beneath his doona as the smoke crept under the bedroom door, the room becoming enveloped in a warm, foggy haze. He could see himself running behind the other children, tracing his fingertips along the hallway walls as they dashed to the front door, feeling how the whole house had become hot and alive. It had been so exciting. The boy flinched as a bug landed on his face. He slapped the fly away and tried to return to his daydream, but the spell had been broken. From his back pocket, he pulled out the shiny watch that he'd taken off the old man's bedroom dresser and swiveled it so that the evening sun bounced off the silver at different angles. The light created patterns on the palings of the wooden fence in front of him, and for a while he sat there mesmerized by the web of bouncing lines. But then he felt frustrated. He didn't know why he'd taken the watch. He just grabbed it out of habit. It reminded him of the ones his mum used to take from her male visitors. She used to love collecting those. But she was dead. The boy looked at the watch again, as one lone tear trickled down his face. It had a shiny silver band that was smooth to touch, and a bright blue face where the numbers sat. His mum would have loved this one. A tightness in his throat made it hard to swallow, as the boy remembered how his mum would let him play with her collection of treasures, and how his heart would rise at the sound of her laughter, when they'd sit together and look at whatever new trinket she'd managed to take from the men who came around. Most of the time she just got coins, but sometimes she'd managed to slip a shiny ring, or a watch like this one. One time, she'd even taken a whole wallet. "We can live like kings tonight," she'd laughed. The boy wiped his face as a clump of snot dribbled from his nose. He hated remembering his mum, because it made him sad. And he hated remembering those special times together, because he knew his mum would never again be able to present him with her treasures. The boy looked at the watch one more time before angrily hurling it at the back fence. It hit one of the nails and bounced off into a garden bed. He stood up, and, once he'd found where it had landed, stomped on it over and over until the shiny band links were tarnished and hidden underneath a layer of soil. Then he kicked the old couple's stupid lemon tree as hard as he could before heading inside. As the back door crashed behind him, the boy smiled. He hated feeling sad. It was much easier to just be angry.